Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode whatever of Politics of Tyranny, the Politics of Tyranny. We're happy to be here. I'm Marc Barnes, very little credentials. This is Andrew Jones, whole bunch of credentials. And we're here to talk about tyranny, to investigate it because, well, it's worth just talking about the way we live today. And we live under a tyranny.
No doubt about it.
Totally true.
Yeah.
I saw a billboard the other day, and it just said, "Good finds a way."
Right.
Didn't say anything else. What insane world do people spend money to tell other people that good finds a way?
Right.
That's what it means to live under a tyranny, because I think we get confused sometimes. Well, it must just be that like bad things happen to us and we have to do what big, strong people want.
What about that weird billboard that's around town that's like the healing power of human kindness?
That's tyranny, man. That one is weird.
That is creepy and weird. Yeah.
And because what we talked about last time is what it's doing is it's basically just saying like the world comes from above, from power that can afford these things.
Yeah.
And you receive it.
Right.
And actually the content doesn't matter because you're not being treated as a person who can actually converse with these billboards. You're just a receptacle.
Right.
People love that, man. People love being receptacles for
It's easy.
It's an easier life. I think there's a rebellion in sort of being stirred up in us in doing these podcasts. What I'd like to do at some point is a good episode on rebellion.
Sure.
Because I think
you want to be on that side.
Yeah.
The Rebel Alliance.
Yeah.
You don't want to be on the Death Star.
Yeah. It's funny because the only way tyrants can operate within our particular regime is to constantly tell stories like Star Wars.
Right.
Right. And then we just are somehow supposed to presume that somehow the real rebels are in fact the ones in power now.
You know how funny that is. I mean, I listen to NPR and stuff frequently.
Oh, I love NPR.
And these people who couldn't possibly be more establishment, like couldn't possibly be more square.
They hit every...
Like just the lamest squares possible. Think that they're rebels.
Oh, yeah.
They think that they're like hippies, like revolutionaries or something.
No.
And it's like, no, guys, it couldn't be more lame.
Yeah. Yeah, they're like, and that's why resistance to the Trump presidency is required. Sponsored by automated 401ks for all of your family members.
It's just unbelievable. Yeah.
But that's just what tyranny is. I mean, we've discussed at the beginning that it has to mask itself.
Right.
It can't even be present to itself because it's repulsive to rule for private gain or to be someone's lackey. Right? We hate that.
Right.
So when we're doing it, we tell lies to ourselves, to our children.
Sure.
And the thing is, I think rebellion is the proper attitude of the Christian within a tyranny. And I think that this idea gets a bad rap because, rebellion is sort of, messy sometimes.
Yeah.
And it's been totally co-opted. So like rebellion just means something like not caring what your dad says. Like it has a sort of infantile...
Some sort of adolescent foolishness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right.
But I think about this in relation to the Bible especially because, one of the things that our country has experienced, a particular tyranny in our country, was actual slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that incited rebellion in actual slaves here in the US of A was the Bible.
Right.
Reading of the Exodus story was profoundly helpful to inciting rebellion. And it's funny because slave owners then had a certain theology where they promised, it's not about actual slavery. It's not about actual tyranny.
Right.
It's a sort of spiritual message of deliverance, Don't actually take off your chains. Don't actually fight against tyranny. The Bible is edifying, right?
Yeah. In fact, the Bible tells you to accept your slavery.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But this is not a good reading.
This is not a good read of the Bible. In fact, it's not a read of the Bible at all. I don't know what book they're reading, but I'm pretty sure it's not the Bible.
I think when I read the Bible, I'm struck by how... I mean, it sounds so silly to say, well, the Bible is very prescient here. It's like, well, yeah, it's
of course it is.
God, right? But, I'm still struck by how it is a book about tyranny.
Mm-hmm.
and about resistance to it. Because when you have, well, I'll ask you a question. Who was the first tyrant?
The first tyrant?
Yeah.
Well, Adam.
Well,
Eve.
okay, yeah. All right, bad question. The first,
Then Cain.
yeah. Yeah, where there's sin, there's
And so on
tyranny.
and so forth.
Okay, all right, bad question. The first king over the people.
We're talking about Babel.
I'm talking about Babel, yeah.
Okay.
So the Jews have a tradition that Nimrod was the first one to wield what we would now pretty simply call tyrannical power,
Right.
lording it over others in a kind of obvious political manner. And I love the story of Babel because it is a literalization of what we're talking about here, right? So we've said a few things. Like one thing that we said is that tyranny involves the use of propaganda. And propaganda is the delivery of a man-made world.
Right, from above.
Yeah, exactly. What Babel is an actual man-made world. I mean, it's a big tower. And we've also talked about how tyranny, when you have rule for private gain, tends towards the homogenization of culture.
Right.
Why? Well, it's because difference, like having diversity, is not helpful when you want to rule for private gain, because it means that people are pursuing ends that aren't your own.
Yeah, and it's difficult to give them instruction.
Oh, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
Right, because you have to speak into the particularity of their
particularity
lives.
of who they are. So you need a homogenized population, at least to the extent that you're trying to get them to do something, like in that realm.
Right, and so what we spoke of is how all tyranny needs bureaucracy, which is an ordering of society, so that the will of the tyrant can be also the will of, those under him, but not directly,
but not
indirectly.
indirectly, right? So their particular wills become, or their particular ends become inconsequential,
Exactly.
right? Because that just becomes their motivation for serving the end of the tyrant.
Yep. And in Babel, this is literalized in that there is one language.
Right.
So people are quite literally able to receive one law and have it be identically repeated all the way down. There's no need to speak into
it's
a
not
particular...
even one language. It's one language and few words.
And few words, that's right.
So there's very little diversity. It's not like different populations have different dialects or different meanings or different... I mean, I think that the takeaway from that is that this is a univocal, direct communication system.
Yeah, commands are given.
And they're understood exactly as they're given, right?
Now the Jews, and I'm thinking about the Midrash tradition, the rabbis, when they looked at this story, what they said is the sin of Babel was in fact a sin against the command to be fruitful and multiply.
Interesting.
So it wasn't just, sometimes we get the idea of Babel just being sort of prideful, like they wanted to go really high.
Yeah, make a name for themselves.
Yeah. But what the rabbis say is that the act of staying still and in one place, building up instead of building out, was effectively the sin.
Got it.
Because when you're fruitful and multiplying and filling the earth, you are by nature resisting tyranny.
Indeed.
What I mean by this is just pretty simple. Like, if I want to rule over a people, it gets harder and harder to the degree that they diversify and move out, both geographically but also spiritually, because this family, separated enough from some kind of central control, develops its own language, its own customs, its own mores, its own way of doing things,
its own sort of material architecture, like the world it builds, the way in which it acts upon the world, the way in which it becomes.
And by necessity, they become sufficient unto themselves to some degree. So they just simply don't need you as much.
Right.
So any tyrant has to. We say that this is sort of an architectural. Well, it's an archetype. Because any tyrant has to change a society. If he's going to effectively be a tyrant, he has to change society from one that is fruitful and multiplies, right, and thus always escapes his control by nature, into one that builds up. You think about the image of a tower. Well, a tower is always controlled by man because there's only one access point. It's the bottom, right? So everyone within that tower can be controlled. But for the Jews, the limitation of Babel here was a violent limitation. You weren't allowed to leave Babel.
So when you say the Jews, you mean where's this interpretation coming from?
So I'm thinking it's in I'm going to say this wrong. The Bereshit Rabbah.
But it's a medieval.
Well, that one is older than that. But there's a really good medieval text, the Sefer Yasher, which is the story of Abraham.
Okay.
Well, it's really a story of, it goes through multiple parts of Genesis. But yeah, it's a medieval text that's just giving detail to
and a lot of these medieval Jewish texts are, of course, based upon more ancient tradition.
Oh, totally.
Like they're just bringing forward and writing down what they have been told.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, it starts with oral tradition and
right,
goes from there.
Right. Okay.
And what this text talks about is that it's describing a tyranny, almost a perfect tyranny. Because what Nimrod does is the way he organizes the world into a whole is he takes captives from different peoples, he takes their children, and he keeps their children in prison. So then he fundamentally now has introduced anxiety into all of the families of the earth.
I should say so.
Have their kids.
Yeah.
This is what I mean when I say it's a literalization. It's
right.
It's like we're talking about these subtle mechanisms, but I'm telling you a story that's just like, okay, here's how it
is. Yeah. Right. Okay.
So he takes their children. And then he threatens the children in order to motivate the parents.
Okay.
And it works brilliantly. So he organizes the whole world, that part anyways, the plains of Shinar, into a whole because everyone's scared.
Okay.
And this is precisely what we said about the tyrant, right?
Right.
Cruelty, the infliction of pain, is necessary to motivate people that would otherwise be at peace.
That's right.
Those families without the kids taken aren't motivatable for the ends that the tyrant is pursuing. They might be motivatable for the common good, but then you're not a tyrant anymore.
That's right. Yeah.
So you see the problem.
Yep.
So anyways, he takes their kids, he orders everyone to a society, he creates one rule, one law, and they're building one tower. Two things are really important. He says that anyone who didn't conform to the thought and language of Babel was punished by being burned alive in a furnace. And that furnace was the same furnace that produced the bricks
to build it.
That Babel was built. And there's this, so you have this description, right, of how the fear is actually productive of the social order. And the social order is literalized. It's the building that they're working on. Which when we talk, we're talking about the whole social
and then it's directly idolatrous. I mean, it is to be God.
It is to
reach God, reach the heavens.
Yeah, and what this text and much older texts say is that there was an idol on the top, and the idol had a sword. I think it was a sword, maybe a knife, raised against God.
Okay.
And pretty much all of the rabbis, when they heard that line you said, "Make a name for ourselves,"
right?
That was a reference to idolatry, to make a god for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, just to be a god. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's a story within this that I really like that gets to what we want to focus in on today. Well, first I'll just say, the Bible is a story about tyranny. So this is right at the beginning. It describes the most archetypical perfect tyranny. A king, a man-made world, a society you can't live, a regime of propaganda, right? A homogenization of culture. And then it adds this. When they're building the tower, there's a story that's told that the sin that kind of cried out to heaven and had God come down to be over against Babel was that when people would fall off of the tower, no one would weep. But when a brick would fall that they were using, everyone would weep because it meant they had to go down. They had to go down, yeah. Okay, so what does that mean? I mean, obviously that sounds like bad people.
Right.
But is that all that's being said here? Is it just like, oh, Babel's full of bad people? Well, yeah, but the way they're being bad is by a reduction, right, of the particular person. That is reduced, and what's elevated is the society itself, or rather the man-made world itself.
Right. So the person becomes nothing other than an individual.
Right.
As that individual is a component of this man-made entity.
Exactly. Like they literally become like the bricks. That's the point of the story.
Yeah, they're less important than the bricks.
Right.
Because they're more easily replaced.
Right.
I mean, they're just less value. Right.
So that is the world that tyranny ultimately builds.
Yeah, that's what they're after.
Now, what happens in the story is really fascinating because God comes down, he looks at this sinful attempt at self-sufficiency, And he punishes Babel, but he punishes it precisely by achieving, through the punishment, what was supposed to be achieved by being fruitful and multiplying, right? So if the sin was to stay in one place, to not leave. Oh, and by the way, we should consider that obviously there's population control written into Babel, right? Because there's actual sacrifice of human beings happening regularly to keep the furnace burning. So you're actually limiting population in order to have a mass that can be coherently governed and kept under one language. So it's something we should probably talk about too.
I mean, I mean, human sacrifice is a whole other issue. It's not only population control, but it's also about the creation of that kind of total anxiety.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Right. Man, that's a whole nother bit.
That's a whole nother thing. But
so God spreads people out by achieving the kind of diversity that would have been achieved by us living out our normal sexual difference, its movement across the lands, and our separation from each other, right?
So he disperses the people into the nations.
Disperses the people by way of dispersing their languages.
Right.
So he creates the difference of culture in them. He creates the difference of worlds like that. So now the story from the Midrash goes that, one person would say, hand me a brick, and the other person would hand him the wrong thing, and they would fight. And then because they fought, they would separate because no one could understand each other anymore. But so when you read it at first, you're this whole like, okay, he changes their languages. You're just like, okay, I see how that would be confusing on a job site. But that's not the point, right? The point is that what you're creating is what was supposed to happen. Like mankind is not supposed to be able to be governed in this univocal manner where no one needs to bow to the particularities and differences of the other, where there's no need for humility because one command can be given, build the tower, and it can be obeyed in a univocal, unilateral, homogeneous manner.
Although it is like often when God acts in salvation history, it works towards similar ends, but in a remedial way.
Sure.
Right? Because the nations are dispersed with languages that they can't communicate with each other, right? Or they're. I mean, that's the impression you get, isn't it?
Yes,
These are basically sealed off from each other. And I think that the organic or the natural dispersion of the human race would have been different than that.
Oh yeah,
like we would have become very heterogeneous and diverse, but in a way in which the borderlands, would have been places of mediation and communication, and we all would have been speaking versions of the truth.
Right.
Translation would have been possible.
Right. And this is actually a big part of the story too. Abram is a citizen of Babel, but he is speaking the original language of Adam, Hebrew, which is a language of great power. So there is this through line where God calls Abram out of Babel, even as he disperses the nations, but there's something different happening in both cases. Because when you look at the nations, now they're at war.
Right.
So they're defined by conflict.
Right.
And this is sort of like a prophylactic effort on the part of God in the sense of he's not like just creating people that are suddenly good. Okay, you did it wrong, but I'm just going to make you fruitful and multiply.
That's like remedial, almost punitive.
Totally remedial, because now what you have is and this is good of him, right? Because he doesn't just get rid of our freedom. He doesn't just take away like our habits.
Like we deserve it. Yeah, like we.
But what he does is he creates the conditions whereby now tyrants are in competition with each other. So what's happening is not what's happening is there's a lot of people trying to build Babels.
Right.
But that's a conflict, right? Because not everyone can be the whole world.
Right. So if one king gets too strong, the neighboring 4 or 5 team up and put him back in his place.
It's exactly what you see as the Bible goes forward.
And that's history, yeah.
Right. But this is really crucial because all of these nations have gods. And if we look at Babel, what we see is that the original attempt was actually a kind of monotheism with a man, Nimrod, a particular tyrant, at its head. So he was the god. or at least the priest of the god. Well, polytheism is usually described, as I've heard it, as this sort of natural thing that man does because he's ignorant or he has to have some kind of cool explanation for the weather. So he makes a bunch of gods, which has never struck me as plausible.
No.
I don't know. You think about children. Like I've never seen a children come up with gods to describe the weather, even outside of but not the point. The point is, that's a bad and stupid explanation. And what you see in the Bible is an alternative one. Rather, man is, if you're going to say by nature orientated towards anything, I'd rather say by sin orientated towards trying to be like God.
Right. Every tyrant, in a sense, is positing himself as the God.
The world comes from me. The language comes from me.
The source of order.
Yes, exactly. And that's obviously Babel.
Mm-hmm.
But now you have everybody trying to be Babel, so you've got multiple gods. So polytheism is better understood as a remedial gift in the sense of it's a check upon unleashed idolatrous monotheism, namely that man will be like God.
It actually, I see what you're saying, and I think that's an important point, a powerful idea, because what happens in the nations, in this diversity of the nations, is that you may think your God is the best and that you're devoted to him, but you're aware that the guy next door also has a God.
Also has a God, yeah.
And that God also seems to be powerful because the guy next door also has an army and also is capable of ordering things. And so what it seems like what happens there is that the gods necessarily move into the cosmos, right? Like they become, and this opens up the possibility for asking the question, who orders the cosmos itself?
Yeah.
Right? It keeps open the door for the Lord God.
Which is precisely how the Lord God actually enters into history with Israel, is as one of the gods.
Right. I
another
will be
nation,
your God. Right.
Another God.
You will be my people. I will be your God.
And at first, the whole excitement about Yahweh is just that he can destroy all the other gods.
He's the most powerful guy around, yeah.
And it is a further development to then say he is the only God.
Right.
Yeah. It's marvelous. So you can see that tyranny is idolatry in some manner, because that desire to rule for private gain terminates in the desire to be like God, to deliver a world that comes from you below and to receive nothing. Okay. So Abraham goes out as a nation that is maintaining the command to be fruitful and multiply. And you see this immediately, that instead of doing the tyrannical thing, he does something very different. So for instance, when Lot and Abraham come into conflict, which is precisely the opportunity that conflict. Oh, sorry, I should explain it. Lot and Abraham come into conflict because they're herdsmen, the people working their lands. They're multiplying. There's a lot of sheep. They are coming up on each other's borders. They're getting in each other's business. So
scarcity.
Yeah, scarcity.
They're experiencing.
We don't have enough resources.
Right.
Somebody get Malthus to describe this first. Well, what do? Well, they, instead of using that opportunity for the production of fear and anxiety by which Abraham can say, okay, we're having these conflicts. Well, you're going to have to do X in order for me to do Y. And you start using the fear in order to gain. Right. Abraham does something that maybe was just new on the face of the earth. He says, all the world is before us. You pick which land you want, and I'll pick my land. Lot is his younger cousin, I'm pretty sure. He has no natural authority. He's not the one that should be making the choice of land. It's a real act of humility on Abraham's part.
It's a gift.
It's a gift. And in fact, Lot chooses the best land. It says in the Bible that it was like unto the land of Eden, whereas Abraham becomes a wanderer. Well, right in that instance, you can kind of see that Abraham is carrying the social order of Eden.
Yeah,
and what it would entail.
It is a directly non-tyrannical act of authority.
Directly. So he takes the original language, he takes the original peace, he takes the original command to be fruitful and multiply, and that's a really good instance of him actually obeying it. Like, people spread out, they get diversified, and conflict is resolved through humility and gift giving.
Right.
Well, I just think it's marvelous, because that's a story of of not being a tyrant. And then, I mean, I don't want to describe the whole Bible for you in particular, but I'll describe just the next part.
Okay.
Because what then happens is really fascinating. You have all these nations that are now at war, and then you have this one thing called well, really at this point, it's just the family of Abraham. That's called to be under the living God. That's called to continue the peace of Eden. That's called to basically be monotheism within a remedial polytheism. It's always prevented from tyranny, this particular family. And it really is a family. That's the other thing.
Right.
The other nations are organized according to the kind of violence done to them. Well, these people all speak this language. These people all speak this language. Their unity is war, right? Like, why are they this group and not that group, right? It's not because of a common peace, first and foremost. The actual war, the enmity, the negation, the attempt to build up a god, which runs into the border of this person's attempt to build a god, actually defines the borders of this particular people.
Right. Whereas
with Abraham, what you're talking about is the family that God made continuing, right? Which is what you can see even the fact of them continuing the original language from Eden, I think shows this. Okay, well, in this war, you see that the nations start to deal with people as Babel did, as a mass. So they're not really changing their ways. One of the stories where I think this is really clear is it's a battle between kings. And if you read the story, and it's actually happening in the plains of Shinar, the same place where Babel was built. So like biblically, like conceptually, it's all still part of Babel in some way. But now it's, instead of the one king Nimrod, it's like 5 or 6 kings that are making alliances and fighting against each other. And actually Nimrod is involved in the fight, for what it's worth. Say the Jews.
Okay.
And Augustine, but whatever. Point is, so if you read the text, you get this weird image of like kings just fighting each other on their own, because it literally says like there were 4 kings against 5, and then the king of Sodom did this against this king, and then the kings ran away and fell in a pit. And there's literally no mention
of an army.
Abraham enters into this battle to rescue his cousin Lot, and it names his army. It explicitly says what he did, and it says the very number. He like went and got 367. I forget the actual number.
Right.
It has high significance, so I'm really sorry to all the Hebrew mystics here for ruining this moment. But he gets a particular number and he goes out of the way to say it. He musters them. He tells them the problem, and they go and they fight the kings. They win against the kings, and then Abraham has this famous line where the king of Sodom then tries to give him property. And he says, no, I will never have the king of Sodom be able to say, I have made Abraham rich. So he fundamentally separates himself from this form of kingship, from the mode of the nations, and says, it won't touch me. So it's a beautiful story in its own right. But what's always fascinating me is the fact that when you produce people as a mass, when you make them the bricks, it's not just like something you can do to have like a homogenous population that you can easily advertise to, though it is that. But it also is the ability for smaller units of power to act in the name of everyone. I think about the Egyptian victory monuments. They would often show the pharaoh just like destroying the Hittites on his own. Like big one-man pharaoh with his club smashes all the Hittites.
Yeah.
They're fun to watch. I mean, they're fun to look at. Well, they're not that fun to look at. Briefly, they can be fun to look at.
Interesting.
Yeah. But there seems to be this connection between tyranny and the production of a mass of people as opposed to a particular people. And the moment that you have this idea that, well, it's not so much a king that's fighting, it's this guy and that guy and
these guys,
and they all had to be coordinated to do it, which that must be what's actually happening. That's the only way. That's the only way an army can really be. But the problem. But once those people are dissolved into a mass, you can actually speak of them as singular in some way. And it seems to me that the whole effort of polytheism, as opposed to what the Abraham's family and ultimately the nation of Israel was doing, is this distinction between the production of a mass of people that can be all subsumed under a tyrant who can act as if he alone acts whenever the army acts, to a kind of social order in which that's simply not possible.
So maybe it would be helpful if you could explain from the Bible. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we'll see. If the form of military or the form of army that we see Israel actually having.
Yeah, it develops,
because they definitely are a military force to be reckoned with, but they're different.
Absolutely. And we always have to remember they're entering into the mode of polytheism, into the war of God against God, but they have to do it in such a way that they are a light to the nations.
Yes.
So they can never do it identically as another nation, right? Because then the victory of God overall isn't actually a victory of anything but one
just another God.
Right. So there's so many ways to approach this. The first thing is that Israel receives a law, and that law modifies the way they can treat groups of people, the way rulers can treat groups of people. We already talked about this a little bit with Moses, but in a really explicit way, it bans census taking.
Right.
So you quite literally can't.
Sort of a bizarre, idiosyncratic thing in the Old Testament, but it's really not.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying.
It makes total sense.
Right.
I mean, one way you could describe the polytheistic warring nations is that they are a people whose rulers treat their populations as numbers.
Yeah.
Which literally means counted people, census.
Like bricks.
Yeah. Israelites are banned from doing that. They have a complex thing that you can do if you want to take a census where each man has to make an offering for his life to the temple. I won't go too far into detail in this, but the insinuation is that to be counted as a number is almost like a death, and you need to be, and not just a death, but a certain like giving yourself over to the king, the ruler, and that you need to be purchased back for God. And so a certain amount is given.
Okay. So that sounds like a compromise of some sort.
It's some compromise, but then you read like in Chronicles, David tries to take a census of a people, and God just like, I mean, it's he gets to choose between like plague or being.
Well, and it's directly referred to as a temptation of the devil himself.
Yeah, temptation of the devil.
I mean, the devil wants you to take a census.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like, even if there is a way out, in some respects, like the thrust is that you don't count people, and there's a Hebrew tradition that no blessing accrues wherever there is counting.
And the reasoning there is that you really can't count persons.
Right. Which might seem, and there's a part of the Bible that really shows this, because Abraham's supposed to be different. He's fruitful and multiplying. The other nations are trying to have sovereign control over, a warring population. God takes Abraham and he says, go out and try to count the stars.
Right.
Right. And he says, if you can count them, so that's how your children will be. Now, as a child, I always got this verse wrong, because what I thought it meant was that there will be as many Israelites.
As many,
as there are
whatever
stars.
Number you came up with, that's how it would be. Sort of similar to the sands of the seashore.
Yeah, if you could count them. Typical tyrannical thinking on my part.
That is totally tyrannical thinking, yeah.
It's not the case.
The point is
that he can't count them.
It's uncountable.
He doesn't sit there being like, I guess I'm going to get somewhere over 600.
There's practically infinite number of people.
No, the point is that it is impossible to count stars.
If you counted persons, it would just be 1, 1, 1,
right.
1, 1.
Right.
You'd never get to 2.
And when we try to make examples of that, having great numbers that are uncountable is a really good way of conceptualizing it. It's not the case that, well, there are technically 17 billion people.
Right.
No, the point is that the relation to the person is one of uncountability. It's one of the best ways we can know people as people is by like shuddering to think of them as simply a repeatable unit that can be represented by a number.
Yeah.
Which is why when the rabbis then talk about this verse and they say, what did he mean when he said that they will be like the stars? They turn to another verse in the Psalms where David says of God that you call each star by its name.
Right. I remember.
And this is used to explain a passage in Exodus where it's just listing the tribes of Israel by name. And it's saying, well, these are the stars of heaven. So for them, it's all fulfilled. The stars of heaven are known by name. God's the only one that can count the stars precisely because he knows
He's the only
name.
one capable of knowing every person.
Right. And so the Israelites are like the stars because they are named
right
by God. And they're known by name. So when you get to Israel military, which again, let's be clear here. I'm not just saying like, oh, militaries are a good example of where tyranny might work. I'm saying that if you look at everything after Babel, you have the organization of nations as military units. Like the creation of a command structure is what tyranny needs.
Right.
It's not the case that you can be like, oh, maybe we can have a bureaucracy versus a military. No, bureaucracy is a kind of military organization of society. Okay. So when you look at the military structuring of Israel, it gets really weird. So they can't be counted, right? And then they have this ritual whenever they go into battle where the tribes are understood as families.
Right. They're called out as families, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So Reuben, Dan, Gad.
Right. And then the families within the tribes.
Yes. And so they're called by name and they're mustered. That is, when there's a conflict, the tribes are called.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this is itself something different because the point here is that there's not a pre-existing command structure.
Right.
The military is not the society. It's a response.
Mm-hmm.
But it's always a response to these families, or it's a response of families as families. So they come together in order to meet a clear and present danger, or whatever it is. And then once they come
which
together,
means it's voluntary, by the way.
Yes, it is voluntary.
Well, I mean, it must be because you would have to have a pre-existing military in order to compel conscripts. Okay.
Right, exactly. But this is the point. Like in a non-tyrannical society, the person is not treated in such a way that he is fundamentally always available to the command.
Right.
The point is that if there is going to be command, if there's the necessity of a higher sort of operating on the lower, then it has to address itself to the lower.
Yes, as an authority, which is then met by an obedience. That's free.
And one of the big obvious signs of this is that there's often disobedience.
Right.
So like Benjamin doesn't show up,
Right.
and then everyone gets mad and they fight as families.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's pathetic and there's squabbling in it. But the point is that it is not tyranny, and that's by law. So God has deliberately created a nation under a particular law that prevents it from being a kind of permanentized military structure. I mean, when you get to Samuel and he's describing what it's like to live under a tyrant as opposed to what Israel's used to, he describes a military society. He says, this is a prophecy of a tyrant.
We want a king like the nations to go before us and fight our battles, which is just harkens back to what you were just talking about, how they mistakenly think the kings are the armies.
Right. And Samuel says, okay, you want a king like the other nations? This is what the king is like. He's going to organize you into a military. So you're going to have some of your sons running before the chariots. Some are going to build the chariots. Your daughters will serve as perfumers, bakers, and whatever for the king. You're all slaves. But the point is you're a war machine and you're oriented, but you're always under that. That was the difference, because otherwise it would have been weird for Samuel to say if they were just if he was simply saying like, you will have to organize in this certain way. It's like, well, yeah, we do that.
Right.
But the point is that this will be life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important, because one of the ways you could describe tyranny is the permanentization of the conditions of war.
Right.
War really becomes, and this is just what it means to abandon peace in some way, which we're saying is the alternative. So it's not that. But you look at the other strange thing with the Israeli military is that when they are mustered by families and people obey or disobey and come together, the commanders are set then and there. So what I mean is, it again is showing that there's not this existing command structure. It's like, well, it's not like the generals of Reuben show up or something. Mm-hmm. It's like commanders are put over the people for the sake of battle. But this only happens after everyone who is afraid is told to go home. So it says, "Are you scared?" I'm being very literal here. It's in Deuteronomy. The priest comes out and is like, "Is anybody afraid?" "I'm afraid." "Go home." And they do. There's other things too. Has anyone just been married? Okay, you go home. Has anyone just planted a field? You go home. Deliberately shrinking the mass. This is like the most insanely stupid military thing to do if you are just trying to be a successful military, I would imagine.
But it's eliminating anyone who's motivated by an ulterior motive, right? Like if you're afraid, why are you there?
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you're
the only reason you could fight under this law is for love.
Right. That's what I'm getting at. Is it's saying this is a force that is motivated by the good of the common good, not by fear.
Right. Exactly. Right. It's not the case. I mean, people have discussed this and said things that are maybe a little more didactic and been like, yeah, well, you don't want the fearful people because if they run away, other people might also run away and things like that. That's true, but it's true within yeah, it is true that the Israelites are actually creating a crazy effective fighting force.
Well, that's one aspect of this, right? Is that when we talk about a just society as opposed to a tyrannical one, at some point we're going to get to the point where we say a just society is actually more powerful.
Way more powerful.
But
it can win wars more easily and with less resources.
Which is what you see in the Old Testament over and over again.
That's what you see. Yeah,
absolutely. Like when they are faithful,
yes,
they win.
Yes.
Even though they have overwhelming opposition.
And when they win, they are often using the tyrannical structure that they're fighting against itself.
Against itself.
Because the assumption of a tyrannical society is the opposite of the Israelite. No one's fighting for love. Everyone's fighting for fear.
Right.
And who do they fear? Well, ultimately, there has to be some central figure because the command structure is already in place.
They fear the king and his proxies.
Right. So just kill them.
Yeah.
And if you look at Israelite military tactics, if you want to call it that, you see this again and again. Just cut off the head of the snake. And then what happens? Well, the Israelites are often described in this position of the armies are just fleeing before them in some way, but it's usually the destruction of the thing that the tyrannical army is afraid of. Mm-hmm. But the point is with the Israelite army, if each person is motivated by love and all those who are motivated by fear are gone, and if they've all arrived as families to be a part of this thing larger than themselves.
There is no head to cut off.
There's no head to cut off. You could destroy a commander, but that commander's been set over the people an hour ago. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like there's obviously some tactical reasons to kill commanders, but the point is they're not fighting because they're scared.
Right.
They're not living because they're scared.
The will of each individual is itself the will to fight, right? It's not
Incredible.
It's not as if they're all, it's not a bureaucracy. It's not as if they're all fighting to satisfy the will of their commander, but they have their own ends. That is the motivation for them fighting. And as soon as that centralized end is eliminated, the only rational thing to do is to flee.
Right. And the way that the alternative is described for the Israelites in the Bible is that God is the head of the Israelite army.
Right. Exactly. God is their king.
But God, and it's either the Bible makes this point, or maybe I've been reading a lot of commentary, so I forget which. But somebody somewhere.
I love that.
Yeah.
What difference does it make?
Yeah. It's like when Paul is writing his letters and it says, as it says somewhere,
I think.
That's confidence. That's the Jewish tradition, man. That God is as present to the particular Israelite as to the whole, because that's God.
Right.
He loves each one. So when you fight for God, you're not talking about like a centralized commander that you all fear, and if somehow that goes away, you scatter. You're talking about one who guides you in your particularity.
Right.
Like the universal is present to the particular and to the group. It's great. I mean, it works.
Right.
I mean, think about the story of Judith, which I love. It's like it works so well. Like Judith is a distillation of Israelite military tactic. It's not, as some people think, this kind of like weird other story, like this one way that they won a battle this one time. No. It's the story of a woman, right? So like the epitome of not the soldier,
right,
going in and cutting off the head of one tyrant, and the victory being won as a result. But that's the way the Israelites work, because that's the way. That's the way of peace. That's the way peace deals with tyranny. So, okay, that was a long excursion on the Bible. But what I hope we've pointed out is that the Bible is a story of an alternative social order to tyranny. Because I think that might sound weird, because isn't tyranny supposed to be the thing that's like odd? But I don't think that's the case. I think if you look at the Bible, most of the world is under tyranny. What's odd is that there is one world that retains the original link to a peaceful beginning.
Right.
The creation as it was in the beginning. and is put under a law that prevents them, even in all their sin and idolatry and falling away, which is real and they do it all the time. It puts them under a law that prevents the actual construction of a tyrannical slave state.
Yeah, and the irony in it is that that law comes from God as if he is their king. I mean, as if he's a king like the nations have.
Yeah.
Right? Like he gives them a law that comes externally to them. Right? They receive it.
Right.
But because it is from God himself and therefore for them and in complete congruency or harmony with the truth of the world itself, to obey that law is not to be a slave, but to be free, even though it is a law that comes from above, right? And this is because this is necessary, of course, because of their condition, right? Yeah. They are a fallen people. And so you have to lead them into their own freedom, right? So there's a beautiful sort of God imagery of God sort of reaching down to them, right? And serving them as if he is their king, and like humbling himself to the point where he could even be mistaken for a god, little g God, right?
No, that's incredible.
Which is such a blasphemy. But he makes that, he's willing to risk that.
Yeah.
You know?
And what I think we need to then discuss how this is most immediately relevant to our tyranny and to what we might say are the mechanisms of tyranny that are constant. And I think what you can see revealed in this discussion of the military structuring of society is that scale is a mechanism used by tyrants. And what I mean by scale is very literal, like treating people in a large group does something. And that something that it does, which I want to investigate, is efficacious unto the tyrant's pursuit of rule for private gain. Fair to say?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it's complicated because the tyrant wants, I mean, his tyranny itself is based upon the idea he can get people to do his will, which is already a reduction of persons to a mass. But then the successful reduction of the mass is what makes his tyranny efficacious, right? So it's like he needs to reduce people to the mass, but that is also what he's like after. That's his end. Right. You see what I'm saying? So it's not merely a tactic, it's also a sort of description of tyranny.
Sure.
That's, I guess, what I'm saying.
Well, you see this in that...
I'm trying to say.
You know, you can kind of see this logically. If the whole point of tyranny is rule for private gain, I mean, private gain is open-ended, as we've discussed. It has this kind of quality that rockets off to infinity and ultimately ends up in you having to play God. Scale has a certain effect that makes this easier. Well, what I mean is pretty simple. If I want to rule 3 people, if I want to be a tyrant over 3 people, I'm not saying I can't. I can. I can be tyrannical to 3 people. But it's hard.
Yeah, it's not easy because let's say we're all in the same room, and you're being a tyrant to me and these 3 other guys, and I know their names, and I look over and go, "Hey, Jacob, what's up with this guy?" You know, and "Hey, Alex," and then we say, "Let's get rid of him." I mean, the point is we know each other.
Take me.
The three of us who are subject to you know each other, can trust each other, see each other, make eye contact with each other, decide to overthrow you, and then have the power to do so.
Exactly.
So if that's not the case, if I don't know the other people who are subject to the tyranny, if I can't trust them, if I'm not sure what they're up to, if I'm not sure what they're doing, then the only rational course of action on my part is to assume that they're just a component of the tyrant. I have to assume that they'll continue to serve him, right? Which is the tactic the tyrant uses in order to get me to subject myself, because of course any individual man has the ability to kill any other individual man. And so the only way to get submission is to convince each person that the other people have submitted to the tyrant in such a way that person can view them as extensions of him.
Right.
Or that's the prudent thing to do.
Right. You have to remove the person from the thought that maybe these people are actually in the pursuit of a common good, which the tyrant is threatening, which means we're together.
Right, which means we're together.
And doesn't Aquinas say essentially that one of the characteristics of tyranny is that there will be a lack of friendship?
He says it's essential that a tyrant destroy friendship. I mean, he actually says something like, in a perfect tyranny, there would be no friendship.
Wow.
And then he talked, because friends produce, he talks about it as producing valor, right? They produce virtue and valor, and men who have friendships are willing to fight and willing to risk things. And but what he's talking about, of course, is that there's a basis of security or a basis of power that comes from outside of the tyrant. And so you're willing to act.
Right.
And so he describes tyrants as being working always towards the destruction of friendships.
Right.
And anything that builds friendships, they understand to be a threat.
Right.
And want to annihilate. And that's important because when we talk about, I mean, friendships are the antithesis of the mass.
Yeah.
Right? So you know your friend, you love your friend, you trust that your friend loves you.
And just imagine a mass of people, but then your friend's there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, as soon as you start identifying friends, then it's no longer a mass. And this gets us, I think, so the tyrant needs to maintain a mass for two reasons, I suppose. I mean, or there's two aspects to the mass, right? Like that he needs a bunch of people to do what he says, to do his will, but then he also needs the effect of that to motivate any individual to do his will, right? The effect of the sort of experience of being at odds with the mass, which is intimidating, right, and terrifying. Yeah. So what undoes this, or the sort of alternative, I guess, would be to hold on. Before I go there, let's talk about scale for a second, because you brought up scale. So it doesn't. When we say scale, I think that what we're getting at here is that the direction of tyranny is always towards increased scale.
Yeah.
Right. So the increased scale makes that mechanism of the mass more effective.
Right.
But it doesn't. But we don't mean that tyranny. And so tyranny always has a degree of that kind of compounding scale. But tyranny can exist at any scale.
Yeah.
The point would be that it requires some scale, right? Which is maybe a weird abstract way to put it. But what I mean is you can be a tyrant over 100 people. But the way to do it is to produce the effects of mass,
right,
of a mass society to the extent that you can over 100 people, which isn't very well.
Right.
And then over 1,000 people, over 100,000. But what you're always doing, what the tyrant's always doing, is positing himself as the top of this, right? So I'm the tyrant over this 100. It comes to me and nothing beyond, right? Or I'm the source of order over these people. That's what he has to try to convince them of, right?
Yeah. So it's not that, because you do get this maybe a knee-jerk reaction to scale as such, especially among, I think, our type of thinkers, right? Like, the like things just appear to be too big to really be humane or like be workable sometimes. Like there seems to be this sort of repulsion that comes with scale. But the point is not that like big things are bad and small things are good.
And that's not the point.
The point is one of the things that one of the ways you can attain one of the ways you can treat a person like they are replaceable, right? Like they are atomized, without friends, and like they are incapable of rebellion for that very reason, is to consider them as a unit within a much greater number. So there's a certain, and for them to consider that too is the trick, and to start to live like numbers within a counted population.
Right, and the idea would be that there's some sort of a stopping point. So you discussed this as being tyrannies are organized in a military fashion, and that is a good example because armies can be really small or really big, but the point is one army is not another army. Like they can fight each other, right? This army is a unit. That army is a unit, regardless of the size of it. And so when you look at the construction of tyrannies, what they need to do is destroy not only internal difference, right? So they want to homogenize internally, but then they're also divorcing the internal from anything external, right? So any bigger sources of order are being cut off as well, right? So it's both a homogenization internally and a cutoff of anything external. So what it's doing is picking a scale and then making that the order.
Right.
Okay, so and this is obvious in the construction of nation states in the modern period and stuff like that, where they're just directly doing this, homogenizing internally, fighting or shedding any sort of connection externally. Wow. Right. And so when you said it's not like good big things are bad or good or little things are good, like that's not the critique here. The critique is that what's good is hierarchy, like properly ordered hierarchy, right? Like it's not like Israel was bad because it was big. It was good because it was an order of families, of the smaller things ordered into the bigger things properly, right? In justice. And so the big thing comes into being as in a different form than a tyranny, right? So it's not like we think big tyrannies are bad, so therefore we just have a bunch of little ones.
Yeah, right.
Like when we talk about the form of tyranny, that can operate at any level. So the form of justice is different. It's a different form. And this is, what is that? And it is that idea of hierarchies of participation and fulfillment, right? And this is maybe a complex idea because it's very foreign to us, I think, to think this way. But if you think about a family, and you think about a family the way in which when a new child is born into a family, and a tyrannical way of thinking would be something like, okay, the Jones family exists, and we are this like static society. And then a new person is born, and then that person has to be initiated into our society and made one of the Joneses, right? So I think that's a tyrannical form, right? But the non-tyrannical form would be to understand that the raising of the new child into the family, the bringing of the new child into the family, is not only an adaptation of the child, but it is of the family. The family is now becoming the society that now includes that child intrinsically, right? Not an act of submission on his part or an act of conformity on his part, but rather the society itself, which is the family, is meeting him, loving him, bringing him in, and changing ourselves, right? In order to be a place, a home. That's what it means for something to be a home, right? It's when you say you feel at home someplace, it's not a place that you've submitted to. It's a place that has been formed by your presence, right? It's a place where you are an essential component to it. Right. And so the family is a place where you can see, okay, this is a non-tyrannical form where my world itself, my social world itself is created at the same time as I am created as a person, right? Like I'm moving into my personhood as the world I'm moving into is being formed to accept me as a person, right? So there you have a family, the individual, the person, the next order in the hierarchy, this sort of family, and the way the family is bringing him up and into the family. Well, then you can say that happens with families together, right? And so you get communities that behave in a similar way, and the families are what constitute the community. And it's not that the families are conforming to a community or submitting to so we have, how many families does the community have? It has so many families that we can count them, and they're all interchangeable. That doesn't make sense. In a healthy community, you would say this is a community of the Joneses and the Barneses and the Nelsons and the Imams and the Wrens and and you'd have to name the families like Israel, right?
Right, yeah.
And when a new family comes in, or when those families change, the community itself is changing in order to love them and bring them in. And so again, the social world at a higher level is as much constituted by the families as being something that the families are kind of ordered by, right? And you just keep pushing that out. Yeah. And there's no reason why that doesn't push all the way out to ultimately include all of humanity. And so the individual person in his personhood finds himself at home in a world that has decreasing intimacy, right? Because you know fewer people. You know fewer people in your community than you do in your family. You know fewer people in your city than you do in your community, and so on and so forth. But those higher levels where they're becoming more distant are appropriately distant. I guess what I'm saying is my family gets to be fully itself in the community, which becomes fully itself in the city, right? And so that whole sort of fulfillment hierarchy was present when I was a baby when my parents were raising me. They were mediating that whole order to me as they brought me into the family. So in a sense, the whole massive order is present in that very first act of love, right? But that kind of an order then is an order that is compatible with both diversity, really, really remarkable diversity, with ultimate unity. Right? And this is what you were talking about when you were talking about the original commission, right? To be fruitful and to multiply and to spread out on the earth, right? And so we would have immense diversity, even in a very fundamental and true commitment to the truth itself, because the truth itself is infinitely complex because it's God, right? And so you can have, every instantiation of the truth or ways of living the truth. There's an infinitely variable diversity of the way in which that can be, but part of becoming someone who lives in the truth, so we say someone who's virtuous or someone who's wise, is coming to understand that other people can live in a truthful and just way in a different form or a different way than you are, right? So the point would be part of the functioning of a just society is the creation of people who don't just tolerate each other's differences, but relish them. Right? Because we every time we see different differences, what we're seeing are different modes of the imaging of God. Right? So as this sort of just society becomes more complex and grows, what you're really seeing is it's imaging God more completely, right? More perfectly. And this truth that it's imaging in so many different ways, the reflections of the truth and all this complexity, both hierarchical and in a sort of diverse sense, are all different ways of living the law of God, right? Or different ways of making the law of God real on earth. Mm-hmm. The law of God, of course, being the second person of the Trinity. So what we're really talking about is Christ, right? The body of Christ. So the church. But all of this is to say, what we're getting at here is that the just society is not a matter of rearranging the tyrannical forms in a constitution that works better, right? We're actually talking about a different form of social order, right? So bureaucracy is not a part of it. Propaganda is not a part of it. Mass is not a part of it. These things are not there, except to the extent that the just society has to contend with unjust societies, and then they maybe sometimes have to, in a sort of remedial or temporary way, ad hoc way, adopt some of the forms. Mm-hmm. Well, something like that.
Yeah. So that's what tyranny's not.
Right. That's what tyranny's not.
So it seems that puts scale as a mechanism of tyranny into perspective, because that is a grand scale.
It ultimately includes the entire cosmos.
And what a massive scale, to use a term here, the difference that simply a massive scale, a scale that is the scale of a mass, is that it's actually something in some ways a lot smaller.
Right.
Because what makes it too large is really just that the persons in it cannot or are not treated as persons. So it's when you have the treatment of people as numbers in a census, as data points on a screen, as functions or offices within a military structure that are all knowable at a glance, or can be,
Yeah, what's wrong with it is that it's an unjust usurpation of the proper hierarchy, right? So it's like you can say something like, children by rights or ought to be in a loving family, and that's where they thrive. And it's like, well, what's larger than a family? What's a bigger thing? And it's like, okay, like a city government or something. Well, what if they raise the children? And it's like orphanages. No, I mean, it's like bureaucracy, standardized thing, people who are working to take care of the children. The children may survive, but there's no way we could say, oh, the orphanage, which is a level higher than the family in this sort of hierarchy, is just a totally reasonable substitute for the family. Right. So I think that what the tyrant is doing something like that, is saying we're going to order all of the goods or everything that human beings need to survive at a level that is a certain level in the hierarchy. It doesn't matter which one you pick. It's unjust, because the whole point is that justice requires the whole thing.
Right. Yeah, and it seems like this is necessary to the tyrant because he's trying to be God. And so he's trying to create a situation in which his law, his rule, affects the whole. But since he's not God, he can't actually be present to each particular person.
But in a proper hierarchy, that's not the case. Right. In a proper hierarchy, it's like, no, authority is present to each individual person, most originally as your father. Right. And then, and so, if you had a just society, I think you would find yourself encountering authority as people who you know their name. Even higher authorities would be mediated to people ultimately through networks of people knowing each other's names. Right.
Yeah, and this is impossible for a tyranny because, it's like we said, if it's being mediated, then you're not God, and you're also no longer in control. So you can.
It completely precludes control, because an actual mediation requires that somebody is taking some sort of the way I like to think of it is some sort of a relative universal from above, some sort of a command from above, and then instantiating it to the particular situation of that which is below them, right? Just like how a father takes the moral law and then instructs his children in a particular form for them, right? And that's not a violation of the moral law. That's in fact the only way the moral law can be taught, right? But it is taught in a diverse way, and so a proper hierarchy would always work that way. So the people who are mediating higher authorities are exactly mediating them. They're not just a conduit. They're actually taking it and then recommitting or retransmitting it, re-articulating it for those people who are below them. It's passing through them as a person, right? The mediator. What that means is that the mediators, the whole hierarchy of mediation is capable of judging each other, right? Because we all have to be aimed at the end of the common good. We all have to be, in our maturity and in our wisdom, capable of prudential mediation of relative universals to relative particulars. And what that means is that we can look sideways, look up, look around, and judge based upon the truth. This person is behaving as a tyrant. This person's making a mistake. That's not what we're up to when someone tells you something who's wrong, right? And so again, it's this order of obedience rather than submission. It's like, I'm obedient to the authority because I love him and I trust him. And even when I am confused by his orders, even when I don't understand it, just like a child who may not understand his father, if he knows his father loves him and he trusts his father, he'll follow along up to a point. But there is a point where even the child says, I don't trust you anymore, right? I'm no longer, right? Like you've abused your authority. And so that sort of a hierarchy then has built into it. It's not some sort of constitutional notion of checks and balances. That's not the point at all. The whole point is that at every level in the hierarchy, human beings are acting as persons with authority on other persons in obedience. And what they're doing ultimately is mediating the truth of God and of the cosmos to those people. But everybody lives in the truth of the cosmos and of God, right? So our common sense or our experience of reality then is not something that we have to put in tension with the social order, but is a confirmation of the social order. Like anytime we experience a tension, there's something that doesn't fit, something that doesn't work, something that bothers us, that means something's gone wrong, and we are allowed to, within a just social order, we'd be allowed to evaluate the order based upon our understanding of what's true. Right? So in a sense, you can say ultimate authority is at every level because God is at every level.
Like the Israelite army.
Like the Israelite army.
Yeah, I think I used to think that, I thought of mass or like large scales, I thought of it as a kind of, not as a mechanism, but as like the problem that a tyrant tries to solve. So it's like, okay, well, we've got these 300 million people. Got to reach them all. So we're going to use propaganda because that's definitely way more effective than going door to door or something. Right. Or like, all right, we've got, all these citizens. Should we deal with them as men and women? That's going to be really tough to distinguish each time. So we're going to deal with them all as neutral citizens with rights. But now what I'm beginning to see is that treating things at the scale of a census, let's just call it that, because that allows us to talk about it no matter what.
Whatever size. Yeah.
That qualitative treatment of persons as individuals, as citizens, as numbers, as units, as something less than what they are. Not the stars of heaven, not the families of Israel, for sure. That treating them like that, and to the degree which they submit to being treated like that, is what enables those mechanisms to be effective. So it's the weakness of the tyrant that needs a mass. He is incapable of addressing himself to 100 people, much less 300 million people in their difference, right? So what treating them as a kind of theoretical legal unit or a conceptual population, what it allows you to do is to speak to them through means that are impersonal. Big signs, ads, things that apply to everyone.
I think another way maybe of getting at the same idea would be that mass society, for example, mass society is always a propaganda society. It can't not be.
Right.
It's always a bureaucratic society. It can't not be. It's not like we're saying it's great to have a big, huge, complex society, but man, it'd be great if we couldn't have bureaucracy. It's like, well, no, like that bureaucracy, propaganda, cruelty, the things that these are essential components of a mass society.
Right, because they isolate people from each other and they create, in the subjective experience, like of the person receiving it, the desire to submit, to be.
Because they present power, right? Like they present power that is not trustworthy. Like you don't know what it wants, but you're scared of it, and so you placate it. It's the return to the gods. I mean, it's like it's producing fickle power. So the mass, right? That's what we were talking about earlier. It produces something that can crush you, but you don't know who it is.
Yeah.
Right. So you're scared of it, and you do what it says.
Right. So in some way, what we're talking about, I always say what we're talking about when we're not talking about it, and that's why I'm bringing it up. Yeah, some way the abstract nature of power is the point. It's like if we keep it abstract, then no one knows who is actually involved in it. And so everyone is equally suspicious of the other.
Yeah, I mean, you think about just insane scenarios, totalitarian scenarios like Stalin or something, where Joseph Stalin is just one guy and rather erratic, and he's capable of creating a system where the secret police are capable of being turned against each other and purging their own ranks. But everybody's so scared of the power itself. Everyone's so scared of everyone else, right? So and you can't trust anyone because friendship has been destroyed. So how would you, among the ranks of the secret police, be able to talk to each other? Well, you wouldn't, and say, why are we killing each other? It's like you wouldn't dare say that, because as soon as you open your mouth, the other person, it's like you don't know, you can't trust the person you're talking to because you don't know him. He doesn't know you.
Yeah.
Anonymity is built into the fear.
Yeah. That's why I love, I don't know, it's sort of a comic moment. I can't think of a particular example, but when someone is like either too poor or just like one of the unwashed or kind of out of it, so that in any of these situations, he's the guy that like stands up and is like, what's going on here? This guy's an idiot. And it's like, everyone's like, oh.
The whole like emperor has no clothes moment.
Yeah. I think that's what you start to long for a little bit, is just people that aren't scared. Because what happens then is everyone then is like, wait, like, am I scared?
Yeah.
And then you can actually have, and what I'm getting at is that the solution to tyranny, such as it is, has got to be in friendship, right? It has to be in the creation of centers of peace where you know other people, and so you're less scared.
Right.
And I think that the problem is we have this, I don't know, this weird mentality that if we just like take over positions of power, that will like run the bureaucracies differently and we'll deal with mass scale differently and more humanely, and like we don't have to actually have a different political form, right? We can simply
aim it at different ends.
But it seems
I think that's just a real philosophical error.
Right, because it's not what form is.
It's not the way form works.
But if you have what practically seems to work, I'm just being very practical here, is to create communities where people aren't afraid.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't necessarily occur to them to be afraid because they have friends.
Or at least they're less afraid so that they are capable of action.
Right. Like, I'm not saying that.
It's just relative, right? The more of a, I mean, it's very obvious, right? It's like the more of a base that you have, the less you desire the rewards that some foreign power can give you or fear their punishments.
Totally.
You're secure. You're more secure.
Right.
Right? Like you have a home, you belong here, you love it, they love you, you'll fight for it.
Yeah. I think what saddens me is that that's supposed to be the church.
Yeah, it is.
And I don't just mean like the church as in like the other Catholics, I mean like the institutional
church. It is
church
the church.
Is supposed to be resistance to tyranny in its structure, in its form, in the fact of its existence, and in its actual activities. Like,
but I mean, don't you think, Mark, I know maybe this is getting kind of, I don't know, maybe I'm wishy-washy on this, but I always think that where you see that form, that is the church.
Right. No, I don't think that's wishy-washy.
So like you're that's the society of love. That is Christ being made visible on earth. That is, now that, like St. Augustine said, that doesn't line up with it doesn't always line up with the institutional church, which is a tragedy.
Yeah, and I think that's all I'm referring to is that the institutional church has seemed cowardly of late in that it has all of the resources, the grace that it needs to help people to become martyrs by not being afraid.
Right.
Because it quite literally unites them in the sacrament to a body of friends, which we call the communion of saints.
Right.
The ends of which are the common good, and in light of which makes all the various promises of the world, threats of punishment and reward, unnecessary. Like, we have a peace here.
Well,
I'm not being theological.
And it's rooted in, so you have the sacraments, of course, grace flowing, and then the teaching, the historical reality of passing through the cross into the resurrection, right? Where the threats of the world, the ultimate threat of the world, torture and murder, isn't the end.
Right, exactly.
Right, like it's like when you say fearlessness, it's like, well, yeah. I mean, to the extent that you really believe that, to that extent, the crucifix becomes something that you may not want to experience, of course, but you'd be willing to experience because of the promise of the resurrection.
Sure. I think we often talk about the conversion of the Roman Empire, which was maybe a just distilled form of this in some ways, in that you had tyranny, you had a regime of fear, and then within it you had Christianity sort of staking its flag. And what you didn't see is a kind of purely spiritual offering of hope, which was obviously there. Like, not spiritual, but in the sense of like hope in the resurrection was real. But what that hope in the resurrection does is it allows people, because they're not scared of death, to not be scared of things beneath death.
Right.
Because they're not as scared of torture, well, then they're not as scared of social ostracization. Because they're not as scared of social ostracization, they're not as scared of like basic conflict. It creates a brave people. And what I'm getting at is that there wasn't this split between like the institutional church and then the church as like those moments of the society of love.
No, the society of love was
the church. And so,
right.
when
they'll know you by your love.
And when the actual church is like developing hospitals and building the first like ambulance services, like things that the pagan world is very novel to them, or like when they're not running away from plagues, but are taking care of both pagan and Christians during the decline of the Roman Empire, or just the fact of like they are actually building a society of support, like the fact that they have alms and the sharing of goods and food and communal meals and a life of subsistence that they're beginning to develop under rulers, under bishops.
Right.
Like this is the description of the creation of a world in which people are always treated as persons.
It's like that was the world I was trying to describe earlier when I gave that big discussion of the hierarchy. Yeah,
it's the church, and it resists.
The church is hierarchical. Yeah,
and it resists tyranny because of what it is. And so, what saddens me, I guess, is just seeing the institutional church somehow imagine itself as just being a part of the tyranny of the world, and yet still trying to produce like
so much of it is confusion, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I know. I mean, this has happened. This kind of thing. We're getting on thin ice. I don't know. I mean, but the corruption in the church historically is almost always not spectacular. It's almost always just worldliness.
Yeah.
Right, where it becomes sort of indistinguishable from the world, from the nations.
Yeah.
And that happens, and then there's normally some sort of reform movement that calls attention to the worldliness, and the people who are worldly, like, what, really? There's something wrong with what we're doing? Like no, I mean, you think about something like the aftermath of the Carolingian Empire, when the church is reduced to this sort of feudal proprietary church system. It's just sort of integrated into the sort of petty nobles and their wars and power struggles. And so the priests are, simony and clerical marriage and all this stuff is going on as a part of this power structure. And then the reformers show up and go, you guys can't do that. And there's loads of people that are like, really? What? We've always been this way. Like, what's wrong? This is the way the church is, right?
Yeah.
Like people don't.
Sure.
And then the reformers have to say, no, I have to convince them that no, that you really can't operate this way. This is wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that, so if we look at you look at the church and you might say, wow, it really just seems to be adopting the tyrannical forms, living within the tyrannical forms, sort of unaware that that's what it's doing. And I think that that's largely accurate. Like they're kind of unaware that that's what it's doing. Right. And that won't last forever.
Right. I mean, look at Israel.
Yeah. I mean, the reform will come. The reform will come. And then we'll look back on it 500 years from now and go, wow,
we were corrupt.
Why did we think that was okay?
Well, that's got a good 500-year hope to it. So appreciate
everything moves in 500 years, 500-year cycles. Yeah.
All right, you heard it here first. Check in on it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, there it is. The creation of a mass society is a mechanism of tyranny. It's what enables the tyrant to function, because he is always checked by actual hierarchies of authority, and he's always checked by the appearance of persons as persons. Mm-hmm. So he has to reduce people to a mass, and then to operate on that mass as if it was what is real.
Right.
So subsequently, the challenge becomes the degree to which people in fact pretend that that mass is what's real, to the degree that they act like it.
Right.
They agree that they act like citizens with identical rights and like repeatable instances of humans or something like,
right.
Which we do this a lot.
Yeah.
The degree to which they do is the degree to which the tyranny is successful. It's seamless. Right. And then the degree to which they experience it as violence is the degree to which the tyranny has not yet succeeded.
That's right.
So you have that kind of just awesome knee-jerk response of like, hey, you're not treating me like a person. You're treating me like a number.
Right.
You're treating me. And I don't think that, maybe something we have to get in later because we've been going on a bit here.
Yeah. I think it's probably
well. So there you go. Treat people like persons.
There you go. That's the solution.
All right. We'll talk next time, maybe in more detail about some of these things. But we really appreciate you being here.
Thanks.
And we'll see you next time.